So Joe, why don't you introduce our first speaker this morning or afternoon?
Yes, our first speaker is Silvia Zanelli. She's a PhD student in transcultural humanities at the University of Bergamo, where she is also a teaching assistant in semiotics. Her PhD project is on Deleuze and Peirce, between semiotics and immanence. And her paper today is Coalescence and Concrescence between eternal objects and actual occasions.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the wonderful organization. I'm going to share the screen. I'm sorry. So today, in this paper, we will try to problematize the vexata questio of the relation between eternal object and actual occasion, and in Whitehead's thoughts. We believe that the Harvard lecture can contribute to show a germinal path in the making and in the development of this difficult interaction. And so delving into the art of the lectures Whitehead gave at Harvard is an opportunity to grasp the making of his thoughts. He sketched, problematized, and open-handed hypotheses on the relation between eternal objects and actual occasions. In this sense, we will focus on the impact that these lectures had on process and reality, with particular attention to the topic of abstraction and concreteness. If in fact in process and reality the distance between universality and abstraction and between particularity and concreteness is clear and demarcated, in the Harvardian lecture it is still an open field, which Whitehead probes in its problematicity. In this regard, some core passages from the lecture can help to clarify the oscillation and ambiguities that Whitehead had to go through before reaching a more definitive landing point about eternal objects and actual occasions in process and reality. So this terminological and theoretical investigation will also allow us to highlight how the idea that eternal object and actual occasion are intimately connected, according to a dynamic of coalescence and mutual implication, is already manifest in the Harvardian lecture and will be corroborated subsequently in process and reality. So ultimately, we will try to show how process is always a dipolar articulation of the actual and the potential, in the attempt to explain the famous Whiteheadian proposition, according to which the general potentiality of the universe must be somewhere. So we will try to propose indeed an interpretation of the relation between eternal objects and actual occasion that goes beyond the Platonic reading of Whitehead, highlighting the foreshadowing of such a vision in the Harvard lectures. In our view, eternal objects and actual occasion are two dimensions and polarities of the evenemential process, but we believe that Whitehead never implies a radical dualism between them. In other words, understanding the ingression of the potential through the actual as a genetic process make it possible to highlight the intertwined dimension of eternal objects and actual occasions. So eternal objects have by nature an ambiguous status and make actual occasion function, presenting themselves as abstract from any actual entity, but on the contrary and at the same time not totally separated from them. In this sense, eternal objects are inter-res abstraction, a bundle of possible words that have differential relevance in determining the qualities of actual occasion. It is tempting to believe that the problem of universal is dead and buried, a textbookish subject of certain pedantry forgotten in the obscurity of the Middle Ages. On the contrary, we believe that Whitehead's thought is a powerful conceptual tool to problematize the relation between generality and individuality in a contemporary way, finding some new uses for old problems to follow a pragmatist guideline. Whitehead retains the core problem of universal, but resemantizes it and seeks to understand it from a global perspective. And this almost imperceptible semantic shift conveys a profound family resemblance. That is, the problem of universal can never be disconnected from a logic of events, from a cosmological vision, and thus it is a universal issue in the sense that it involves the universe in its open totality. So Whitehead targets the real as a whole, not just the physical universe, but the real in its limitlessness. The problem of universal seems in part to be one-sided, whereas for Whitehead, on the contrary, the problem of universal is never such in isolation, but is always the bifurcated problem of universal, or rather, as we will try to show, the problem of eternal objects plus the problem of individuation. So ultimately, the articulation of the universe is the continuous process which takes place in the interplay between actual entities and eternal objects. Indeed, the task of any speculative philosophy is the need to establish a coherent and systemic plan where every element of reality finds its place in the indefinite openness of processuality.
Silvia, would you mind zooming in a tad? Just it's a little bit small.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. I'm on page 3. And so rationalism for Whitehead is a never-ending event and an open adventure. And this distinction between eternal objects and actual occasion begins to take shape within the Harvard lectures. And there seems to be no earlier use of this terminology that became widely used in his later works, beginning with Science and the Modern World. As Whitehead points out in a brilliant way in the Harvard lectures, the riddle of the universe is stretched between the actual and the potential. And I quote from Harvard lecture 2, accuracy, a battleground. If you over-individualize the universe, you never can get it together again. You will never be able to get it together again as an afterthought. You can speak of the how without referring to the what, and vice versa. Every specific what is always a what in the universe. So the problem of universal is therefore at the same time the problem of the actual, and vice versa, the problem of the actual is the problem of the universal, since there is no possible universe outside the boundaries of this dipolar articulation. Following a lapidary but equally eicastic annotation from the Harvard lectures, where Whitehead condenses the complexity of his philosophy into a globe, no eternal objects in isolation from actual world. So the relation between eternal objects and actual entities must express the coherence of the whole. Literally, from Latin, coherent means being united together. So coherence is, after all, a form of coalescence, that is, of indiscernibility. No entity can be definitely disentangled from the texture of the universe or conceived in total abstraction from it, whether actual or not. According to Whitehead, indeed, and I quote from Process and Reality, the texture of observed experience as illustrating the philosophical scheme is such that all the related experience must exhibit the same texture. Thus, the philosophic scheme should be necessary in the sense of bearing in itself its own warrant of universality through all experience. The universal of universal is ultimately the universe in its ineradicable creative function that unites the actual and the eternal into a continuous evenemential flow. So the universe is a togetherness, a being together in a regime of coalescence, and its creative evolution is structurally dependent on the relationship of continuous postponement without transcendence that is established between disjunction and conjunction. Following a Deleuzian concept, one could say that the relation between actual occasion and eternal objects has the form of a disjunctive synthesis. So the togetherness of the universe as a whole, and I quote from Process and Reality, presupposes the notion of creativity, many, one, identity, and diversity. And the ultimate metaphysical principle is the advance from disjunction to conjunction. Eternal objects are the motor and the engine of the actualization of the actual, the shadow of all actualization, its mobile precondition. They make the actual function by determining its determinacy. And this process of actualization that always must take place represents the eternity of the cosmos, as well as the process of ingression of eternal into actual. Eternal objects thus represent bundles of possible world, indeterminate and undecided, but not undifferentiated in their configuration, as they make the process of determination of the actual occasion function. In other words, eternal objects determine the creative order according to which the rhythm of the actual concurs incessantly. So the ontological principle guiding Whitehead's philosophy of organism is always amphibious, that is, double-lived, and postulates an indissoluble and indiscernible solidarity between the domain of the actual and that of eternal objects. The universe is thus nourished by the continuous threshold between the actual and the eternal, That is, the virtuality of the eternal is the mobile precondition that determines the rhythm of all actualizations. Thus, the cosmos is a continuous oscillation between creativity, concrescence, and eternity that are well together by the coalescence of the universe in its open totality. Actuality is a decision. It has a cutting from a certain perspective of the texture of virtual and eternity, which is always seen under a certain respect. This cut, which is a moment of pure discontinuity, nevertheless occurs in the amid of pure potential, which are a kind of primordial shadow in which every conceivable actualization floats and emerges in the surface as a drop of experience. Although Whitehead himself affirms a possible conceptual overlapping between eternal objects and Platonic forms, his theoretical account of eternal objects goes beyond any Platonic dualism. Indeed, Whitehead philosophy is not a plain exegesis of Plato's writings, and eternal objects are not necessarily limited to Platonic forms. The relationship between indeterminacy and determinacy is mutual and intertwined, and eternal objects and actual entity are two sides of a single coin. The process is thus always a dipolar operation in which eternal objects flow and afflux into actuality. While individuality circumscribes the power of the general, eternal objects represent on the other side the indissoluble tangle of pure potency, or the informal ground of dateness that is always cut by the nexus and concrescence of actual occasions. If modern philosophy has crushed the problem of the universe in a polarizing contrast between universal and particular, for Whitehead, on the contrary, actual and eternal co-implicate each other in an ineliminable manner. Since the particular does not exist as absolutely particular without any relevance to other particulars, just as there is no universal per se, since every universal is only what it is in its specificity, and therefore also in its particularity. But then, what does exist for Whitehead? According to him, only the event of the universe in its dipolar articulation between the actual and the eternal, categories that shuffle the traditional card of the classical problem of universal. To think dichotomously particular and universal is ultimately for Whitehead to do violence to thought and to its state of busing. So the terms universal and particular are unfortunate in their applicative use, but also in the theoretical presuppositions they imply, to the extent in which they fail to grasp the complexity of the real in its dipolar rather than dualistic articulation. Eternal objects are thus the pure power of the cosmos, which is a continuous process of imbalance and rebalancing between indeterminacy and determination. Reality, moreover, preserves the memory of every possible pure past, of every track that in eternal objects remains in principle open as a range of possibilities. In other words, actual entities make reality real, realizing the potentiality of eternal objects. So the reality of permanent objects is immanent to the actual, and nature for Whitehead is in its systemic dimension is such there can be neither events nor objects without the ingredients of objects in events. It is thus the interest that the power of eternal objects is released, and not as elsewhere or beyond the actual, but precisely through the interstices of the processuality of concrescences. As Heath writes down from the Harvard lecture, and I quote, "All generality is complied with in the particularity of this real world, and Whitehead cannot convince himself that any general law extends beyond the bounds of the particular world, given by the particular occasion, and that all knowledge is grounded in the evidence in the particular occasions." There is thus a fundamental divergence from Platonism, an innovative attitude towards the eternal in which the full theoretical height of Whitehead's thoughts is measured. Whitehead does not create a transcendent hiatus between the world of ideas and the world of the actual. Despite the radical heterogeneity between eternal objects and actual occasion and the two modes of existence they have, it has potential and actual, there is nevertheless a common evenemential interchange between the two domains, which are always in common and in relation. Always its notes. Here, Whitehead differs from Plato. He cannot tear apart the realm of ideas from each particular event, nor vice versa. The reality of the process is first and foremost the relationality of eternal objects that make the relationality of the actual work. And I quote from Harvard lecture 2, In abstraction, do not get a class of unrelatedness, exempli gratia, Plato's word of idea, because the relational character is of the very essence of eternal objects. So ultimately, the relation between eternal objects and actual occasion is closer to the Spinozist distinction between natura naturans and natura naturata, that is, in the relationship between the same and the other, between one and many, between mode and substance, the play of the cosmos rather than the problem of universals take place. Events or actual occasion are aspects of eternal objects and vice versa. Ultimately, every concrescence therefore needs a structural coalescence with the eternal and the domain of eternal objects in order to function. Eternal objects are the function of all other participating entities in an event. They are not ideas, universals, or concepts, but ideal realities that can only function in the rest. And thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. You got us right on time, right out of the gate. Thank you for that. That's excellent. So as people are gathering their thoughts to be able to ask a question, feel free to use the reactions to give a virtual round of applause to Silvia. Thank you for starting us off. Again, a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, go down to the reactions button on your Zoom bar and raise your hand. If you would rather not ask it orally and you have a question, then you can also put it in the chat and I can pose it to our speaker as well. So anyone like to start us off here at the beginning? George, please.
Well, first, thank you so much for that. Should we say Professor Zanelli or Dr. Zanelli, or not sure how you should be addressed, but
I'm just a PhD student.
still okay, Ms. Zanelli then. I wanted to call attention to what I think is going to be a useful comparison between the work you've done on the universal and the actual, and Paul Bogart's work on the difference between evolution and organism. That is, there is I think in both, a kind of dialectical tension between possibility and actuality that seems to drive the process of creativity. And I guess the wonder is this, whether it's the emergence of new forms in evolution or the emergence of new possibilities in finite actualities, is this to be understood kind of as like a Hegelian dialectic, or with tension between opposites? Or is this more like a, I don't know, something more, how would you put it, less dramatic than that? No Sturm und Drang, just a kind of continual processual flow without the tension and the opposition.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. And I always struggle with this question, also between Peirce and Deleuze, which are my main interest. And so I tried with Whitehead to highlight the same problem, which is the tension, as you said, between the actual, the potential, and so the general individuality and pre-individuality. And I think that a Deleuzian concept is very useful, which is disjunctive synthesis. That is a way to overcome the Hegelian dialectic by making a constant dialogue and a mutual implication between two different domains, but without any transcendence and in a process that is always immanent between the two polarities. So I guess that it could be useful to think about the process and its dipolar articulation is in this way. So more in a Deleuzian way rather than in a Hegelian way, but maybe I'm too much influenced by Deleuze.
Thanks for kicking us off, George. Appreciate it. Anybody else? Landon, please feel free.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I'll try to keep my question short because I saw Matt's hand go up too. your paper is really interesting to me because it focuses on, I'm obviously interested in eternal objects too, as someone who does philosophy of math quite a bit. And I was sort of focusing on HL2 and symbolism. And I was curious if you could talk about your thoughts on how sort of eternal mathematical objects are cognized or understood through actual entities for Whitehead, particularly infinitely large ones or number series that go on indefinitely. Because one thing I'm sort of puzzled by is, well, I'll just leave it there and see if you could say more about certain kinds of particularly troublesome eternal objects. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And I have to say that this is not my expertise at all, mathematics and logic, so I will try to answer. But what I think it's important, again, is to highlight the relation between eternal and actual. So to see the interplay between mathematical and eternal objects and how they determine the qualities of the actual. So I think it's really interesting to follow this path of interaction and to see how also mathematical objects works interest. But it's not my expertise at all. So I'm sorry if I cannot answer properly.
All right, let's invite in Matt. Matt, what are you thinking?
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Silvia. Really appreciated your paper. I'll be presenting tomorrow on eternal objects as well, and it's such a difficult topic. My question for you has to do with what, at least on the surface, appears to be a tension, even a contradiction, where Whitehead in Science in the Modern World does speak of eternal objects isolated, his word, in abstractive hierarchies, whereas in HL2, he says, as you quoted, no eternal objects in isolation from actual world, page 379 of HL2. And so perhaps he's speaking in different contexts here. I mean, when he says eternal objects are isolated in their abstractive hierarchies, he's talking about the relational essence of eternal objects. Have you noticed this issue? And if so, what do you think about it?
Yes, and I'm working on PERS, so I have the same problem while working on PERS and reading his collected paper, because it's always very contradictory, in particular in talking about the relation between universal and actuality. But I think it's a way to try to stress the problem of the relation between the universal and the actual. And I don't think that Whitehead repulse the idea that eternal objects are in a way abstracted from the actual, but they can be seen as abstracted, but only theoretically, and in practice, on the other side, they always work in the actual. So it's an abstraction itself to think eternal object abstractly. But if you look at the practices, then you cannot, as Whitehead stress in our lecture too, you cannot isolate eternal object from actual occasion. So I think that it's only a theoretical abstraction to abstract them from the individuality of the facts. But and then if you look at them interacting in practice, you cannot tear one realm from another. And I find it very interesting when there were some notes in the Arval lecture about his student, highlighting that is very close to Spinoza. And I think it's a way to understand this interaction from natura naturans and natura naturata, which are always in relation. And yes, you can abstract natura naturata from natura naturans, but it's always an abstraction and not a practice. So I think that what can answer in a way is that you have to look at practice to see this interaction that can be theoretically separated. So this is my answer, that is partial, of course, and open. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Before we go on to Regina, I just wanted to ask if you could say a little bit more. Do you think that HL2, the new materials, is it adding? So one way of thinking about another version of Matt's question to my mind is also just whether or not these new materials are new in the sense they're changing or informing how we should be reading Whitehead. Of course, this, right? So do you find when you were asking this question about particulars universals through the lens of the materials in HL2, does it substantively add new that we didn't already have or not for you?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, in particular the Arval lecture 1, because as it's written in the notes, it's the first time Whitehead mentioned the notion of eternal in connection to objects. So I think that's something new to work on, and not only from a terminological point of view, but also theoretically. So questioning why he approaches this distinction so clearly in this lecture, and why he begins to work on this junction that is also a synthesis. So I think it's important to read these two books.
Wonderful. All right, Regina, what are you thinking?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Silvia. I have two questions, but you can just reply to the one you want. And the first one is if you can explain a little bit more when you said that the problem of the universal is the same of actuality. And there was a passage of your talk where you said that. And the other one is, since you mentioned Peirce a couple of times, you know that Peirce has 3 categories actually. The first one is possibility, that corresponds to novelty. The second one is actuality, and the third one is potentiality. Since, as you said also, potentiality as reminds to this kind of continuity that is developing through time. So since Whitehead emphasizes so much the place of novelty, how you would you put novelty in between this articulation or the polar articulation between the actuality and the potentiality? Thank you.
Okay, so the second is a very tough question. And I'm thinking also about Deleuze and this distinction between the virtual, the actual, and the possible. And it's always difficult to find the differences between some thinkers and their uses of the term possibilities, actuality, potentiality. So it's a riddle in a way. But I think novelty, it's perfectly suits the position between eternal objects and actual occasion, because eternal objects are to be seen in the interplay of the concrescence and nexus. And so I think that novelty is a sort of bridge between eternal objects and actual occasion, a mediation, but not in an Hegelian sense again, but in a Peircean sense. So I think that novelty is what connect eternal objects and actual occasions. And also about I told that the relation between that the universe, the problem of universal is the problem of the actual. Yeah, I was talking about the mutuality of actuality and universality. So I was trying to highlight that for Whitehead, the problem of the universe is always the articulation of the actual and the universal. So of course, the problem of universal is the problem of the actual, but on the other side, the problem of the actual is also the problem of universal, because I find that sometimes when studying textbook about the Middle Ages, we only focus on the question, the problem of universal, and we don't see the other part, but we see it just as a degenerated one of the problem of universal, but this is very Platonic. So on the other side, I think that Whitehead can help to understand how the problem of eternal and individuality is always a dipolar one, so a mutual implication or a disjunctive synthesis. So that's my brief answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. This has been a great start. Really appreciate it. We are right on time, and I'd like to encourage everyone to give a nice virtual round of applause to Silvia Zanelli for starting us off. Thank you again.